Okay, this is the cast of representative actors on today's stage. We'll hear first about Diocletian, who brought the century of the bad emperors to a close and made some important changes in the organization and administration of Rome, including moving out of the city of Rome itself. We'll also hear about Constantine the Great, who made the momentous decision to legalize Christianity, but put off his own baptism till he was on his deathbed. The legalization of Christianity opened the way for the building of the first great churches, and we'll hear about some of them and see what they look like today. The first century after the legalization of the faith also saw the careers of three of the four great doctors of the church, as they're called, Jerome, Ambrose, and Augustine. So we'll hear about their adventures. Some say the Middle Ages began with Diocletian, some say with Constantine, and some say with Theodosius I. Gibbon, I think, says that the spirit of Rome expired with Theodosius. And his son Honorius was certainly not very spirited. Gibbon says he passed the slumber of his reign, an indifferent spectator to the ruin of the empire. It was in his reign that the city of Rome was sacked by a foreign army for the first time in 700 years, and it was not long after his reign that it happened again. So those are some of the achievements, events, and catastrophes on the program as the empire declines toward its fall. This is the Diocletian group, as it's called, part of the loot which the acquisitive Venetians brought back from the sack of Constantinople in 1204, and it's thought to represent the Emperor Diocletian. He'd be the bearded fellow second from the right, with his three associates we'll hear more about in a minute. After the assassination of Aurelian in 275, when it seemed that the Roman Empire was going to collapse into irreversible chaos during a gloomy decade of crimes and catastrophes, the 11 serious claimants to the throne after Aurelian were all assassinated. Diocletian became the next strongman to reestablish something like government, at least for a time. The measures he took to restore stability, however, presupposed two things that indicate how much things had changed. First, he divided the empire into four administrative parts, essentially admitting that it was not realistic to try to manage the whole conglomerate still called Rome from one central capital. Secondly, in his administrative scheme, the city of Rome itself was not to be one of the four centers. Maximian would be in charge of Italy, with his headquarters in Milan. Constantius Chlorus would rule Gaul and Britain from Trier. Galerius would rule the Balkans from Mitrovica, modern Sirmium, near Belgrade. And Diocletian would have his own capital at Nicomedia, east of Byzantium, which was not yet Constantinople. One of the most spectacular sites which survives from approximately the time of Diocletian's reign is the Villa Romana del Casale on Sicily, near the town of Piazza Armerina. Amazingly, despite the size and magnificence of the place, it has 60 rooms, it's not known to whom it belonged. It's primarily famous for its mosaics, which are maybe not in the same class as works of art as some earlier examples like those from Herculaneum and Pompeii, especially the Alexander mosaic from the latter, but the sheer quantity of the work is probably unsurpassed in a private home of the era. Some of the most often reproduced subjects depict the transport of exotic animals, elephants, rhinos, ostriches, as well as the famous bikini-clad sporting girls. The walkway around the peristyle has some of the finest work. Again, the subjects are mostly foreign animals. Rome was still a very important place, however, but it is true that most of the later emperors did not spend much time there. I'm not certain Diocletian was in Rome more than once or twice in his life, but in any case, his name is attached to the largest baths ever built in the city, surpassing in size even those of Caracalla we saw last time. And that indicates he still held the place in high regard, I guess. I mentioned the importance of this kind of thing to the Romans earlier in the quarter. They are, baths like this, probably the most characteristic buildings of the empire, though their ruins are not perhaps as spectacular as those of the amphitheaters, which are in many cases still usable. And in a manner of speaking, the baths of Diocletian are still in use. Here you see the church of Santa Maria degli Angeli, which in the 16th century was built, at least in part under the supervision of Michelangelo, into the ruins of these baths, using considerable parts of the surviving decoration and masonry, like the giant porphyry columns. Ironic though it is, we probably can get the best idea of what the ancient Roman baths were like from late Renaissance and Baroque churches like this, whose architects were consciously or unconsciously influenced by the look of the ancient baths. I can just imagine an ancient Roman walking into St. Peter's today and asking where the massage rooms and the swimming pool are. When Diocletian took over, he said that he would abide by a self-imposed term limit of 20 years, and he stuck to this. Very few men in history with as much power as Diocletian had have been able to give it up voluntarily this way. Diocletian and the 16th century Holy Roman Emperor Charles V are the two standout examples, and even in their cases the decision was in part dictated by poor health, so maybe we should consider that even these abdications weren't voluntary without qualification. In preparation for his retirement, he had a giant villa constructed on the coast of what's now Croatia at Split. This was so large that, as we'll see, a good part of the modern city is within its walls today. In the center of this artist's idea of what it was once like, you can see the main hall with the architecturally significant courtyard in front and Diocletian's tomb or mausoleum to the right. In his 20 years, Diocletian made a lot of serious efforts to stop the decline of the empire and stave off the fall. He tried fixing prices and wages. He tried forcing people to stay on their land and not migrate to the cities. His efforts in this direction have led him to be called the ultimate founder of feudalism by some. He nationalized industries and employed the poor on gigantic public works projects, and he tried to stamp out the Christians, whom, like Gibbon, he considered one of the empire's main problems. To deal with all this reorganization, he also created a gargantuan and inefficient bureaucracy. When he was finally fed up with workers, bureaucrats, and Christians, he abandoned the world for his own private Shangri-La here. Here you can see Split as it looks today from the air. The domed vestibule of the hall still survives, with the courtyard just above it in this picture, and the mausoleum later turned into a Christian church with the bell towers on the right. The story goes that after his retirement, things began to go badly in the administration he left behind, and an attempt was made to persuade him to return to power. He responded to this by saying, "If you knew how much satisfaction gardening now gives me, you wouldn't ask me to come back and rule the world." This is the courtyard of the palace, and it is an important piece of architecture because it is usually said to have the earliest surviving arched colonnade enclosing it. As I've mentioned in the past, for a long time the Romans used the arch at least almost exclusively for big engineering projects like aqueducts and arenas. The architects of Hadrian's day, again as I've mentioned, often get credit for first using the arch in a sort of decorative, more architectural way to highlight something like an altar or an entrance, and we see another example of what is sometimes called a Hadrianic arch at the end of this courtyard leading into the vestibule of Diocletian's palace. The arched colonnade is sort of just like a repetition of this arch on columns. We don't know the name of the architect, but despite Diocletian's persecution of the Christians, this architectural innovation proved very popular with later builders of Christian churches. St. Paul outside the walls, which we'll see later, looks just like this courtyard with a roof on it. This is the Porta Aurea, or Golden Gate, still surviving in the wall of Diocletian's palace complex there at Split. And it also is an interesting piece of architecture. Originally, it also had an arched colonnade decorating it, but later Vandals removed the columns to use in other buildings, creating by their theft perhaps the earliest surviving example of the columnless arcade, which was also to prove very popular in later medieval architectural decoration. In the fallout after Diocletian's abdication in 305, the sons of two of his former associates rose to the top to compete for control. In 306, Constantius Chlorus, the fellow who had been in charge of Gaul and Britain, died at York, and his son Constantine was acclaimed Roman emperor by the troops there. Here you can see some of the surviving ruins at York, which was the capital of the province of Britain at the time, and still has perhaps more Roman remains than any other city in England. The section of the wall you see in this picture was already old in Constantine's day. Both Constantine and his mother, St. Helena, are sometimes said to have been born in York, but it's unlikely that either actually was. Meanwhile in Rome, Maxentius, the son of Maximian, had likewise been acclaimed emperor by his army. He began the building of the Basilica of Constantine and Maxentius, which you can see here. It was finished by Constantine after he defeated Maxentius and has borne the names of these two enemies ever since. The Romans did not invent concrete, but they were the first to exploit it on a large scale in buildings like this. Here you see it now from the south looking across the Forum. When it was new, and it may never have been entirely completed, it occupied most of the whole east end of the Forum. Only about a third of it survives, but that's still enough to make it one of the largest ruins in Rome. The vaults that survive are 80 feet high, and those in the missing central section were 30 feet higher than that. Although it's called a basilica, it doesn't have the usual shoebox shape of most buildings which are called basilicas. It really looks more like the kind of building used for the baths. In any case, it also influenced Renaissance and Baroque architects who came to Rome looking to find inspiration for building projects of their own day. On the whole, Renaissance architects were more influenced by the traditional basilica, Baroque architects more by the baths of the Romans. This is the Arch of Constantine in Rome now, the largest ever erected there. Just as Pompey had told Caesar not to bring his army back from the north unless he wanted a fight, so did Maxentius now tell Constantine the same thing. But he was no more intimidated than Caesar. Constantine crossed the Channel, then the Alps, then, metaphorically speaking anyway, the Rubicon, and at Saxa Rubra, 9 miles north of Rome, the two armies met, and Constantine was victorious. A four-sided arched monument was also erected where the battle was fought along the Flaminian Way. It still exists, but as you can see, it has been essentially incorporated into a building. His victory, which is often called the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, because Constantine pursued his enemies back toward Rome, and in the crush of refugees, Maxentius fell off this bridge on the northwest side of the city and drowned in the Tiber. A day or so before the battle, according to the historian Eusebius of Caesarea, Constantine saw a cross in the sky, and the inscription in hoc signo vinces, by this thou shalt conquer. And that night he dreamt that he should have his soldiers put the Chi Rho, a kind of monogram made from the first two letters of Christ's name in Greek, on their shields. The historian Lactantius, who was the tutor to Constantine's children, tells essentially the same story. Tradition says this was so ordered, and the victory was then achieved by a nominally Christian army. Here's the Arch of Constantine up closer now. It's essentially between the Forum and the Colosseum. It is not much admired by art historians. Much of the decoration was stolen from other monuments, and what's original is considered poor. Constantine was, at the time of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, probably already inclined to look favorably on the Christians because his mother was one. Mothers occasionally do have some influence on their sons. But after his victory at the Milvian Bridge in 312, he resolved to make Christianity legal, while not technically becoming a Christian himself, since he put off baptism till he was on his deathbed. By the Edict of Milan in 313, he carried out this resolution, and with this event one could argue the Middle Ages began. Christianity was to become the dominant influence on European life for more than 1,000 years. The extent to which Constantine's conversion was motivated by political expediency of some sort is still argued about, but while it wasn't a conversion like that of St. Paul's certainly, neither was it motivated altogether just by practical or political interest. I think, like most of the church's, Christianity's early converts, Constantine was primarily motivated by the promise of eternal life. It's true that other religions promised this, but they didn't have people like St. Paul, not to mention God, on their side. They just weren't as convincing. The Christians, still reeling from the persecution of Diocletian, made up no more than probably 5 or 10% of the population, so it's not obvious that their support would have done him that much political good, though he may have thought that the strong support of even a relatively small minority would be valuable. As things turned out, however, once the faith was legalized, all the various factions within the new religion began quarreling so destructively that one can seriously question whether Constantine in fact benefited from the Edict of Milan in any political way at all. Here you can see what remains of the colossal statue of Constantine that once stood in the western apse of the Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine, and which now startles tourists visiting the Palazzo dei Conservatori Museum. The emperor was actually apparently represented sitting, and even then the figure was some 40 feet high. As I said, if Constantine expected the Christians to be a unifying force supporting him, he was soon disappointed, for they were anything but unified. There were followers of Marcion who refused to accept the books that would come to be known as the Old Testament of Scripture. There were Montanists who wanted to do away with all church organization. There were adoptionists who argued that Jesus was, as it were, just the designated or adopted Son of God, not his real Son. There were Donatists who claimed that the sacraments were invalid if they were administered by a sinful priest. Here you can see the portrait statue of Constantine up closer now. One of the most serious problems was with the Arians, the followers of Arius of Alexandria, not to be confused with the Aryans spelled with a Y rather than an I who speak Indo-European languages. The Arians held that Jesus was not of the same substance with God the Father, but rather that he was a created being with divine power, sort of like Hercules. On the other hand, the followers of St. Athanasius, who became the chief opponent of this view, argued that Jesus was, in fact, of the same substance, consubstantial with God the Father. To try to get some consensus about what one had to believe to be accepted as a Christian, some sort of lowest common denominator, Constantine called what came to be known as the First Great Church Council, the Council of Nicaea, in 325. Here are the ancient walls of Nicaea, modern Iznik, across the Sea of Marmara from Istanbul, and only about 50 miles from Nicomedia, modern Izmit, which was Constantine's imperial residence before he moved to what became Constantinople. This is also the place you may remember which was Pliny the Younger's headquarters as governor of Bithynia, and from which he sent his famous letter about the early Christians to Trajan. The council is said to have met in the Senatus Palace, only a few pieces of which survive here on the shores of Lake Iznik. The primary result of the council in 325 was the writing of the Nicene Creed, which eventually became, with some modifications, the Credo of the Mass. Along with the adoption of this creed went the condemnation of what came to be known as the Arian heresy. Jesus was affirmed to be of one substance, consubstantial with God, and yet fully human at the same time. However difficult it might be to comprehend this, Thomas Aquinas says it's just something that has to be taken on faith. By way of compromise, it had been proposed that Jesus be considered just of a similar substance with God, but this too was rejected. This whole business has sometimes been called the iota controversy because the Greek words for same and similar, homoousia and homoiousia, differ only by an iota, our letter I. Pope Sylvester I, who is almost certainly not the fellow who baptized Constantine, despite an old legend to that effect, did not attend the council, but sent two legates supporting the Athanasian view, the view expressed in the Nicene Creed.
In this aerial view, you can see where the palace was, and also below it the submerged ruins of a probably late 4th century church. The level of the lake, Lake Isnik, has been frequently altered over the centuries by earthquakes. Several of magnitude 7 or more have occurred within the last 100 years.
Sylvester is also said to have been made the beneficiary of the spurious donation of Constantine, giving temporal power over Italy to the Roman Church. Even if Constantine didn't make the Pope the King of Italy, however, by the end of the 4th century, the bishops of Rome were successfully claiming to be the head of the Church, and this claim was generally accepted in the West, although in most of the Greek East, the emperor himself, until 1453, was regarded as the real head of the Church. We'll hear more about all this later. As I mentioned above, it was affirmed at Nicaea that the Son was consubstantialem Patri, of one substance with the Father. The Nicene Creed goes, Credo in unum Deum, I believe in one God, et in unum Dominum Iesum Christum, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, filium Dei unigenitum, genitum non factum consubstantialem Patri, the only begotten Son of God, born, not made, of one substance with the Father. Further, and this phrase is usually significantly capitalized for emphasis in the Missal, et credo homo factus est, and I believe he was made man. It's not hard to see why Arianism, with its more common sense claim that Jesus was just a heroic mortal, was hard to stamp out. Even the bishop of Constantine's own capital at Nicomedia, although he signed the Nicene Creed, was a supporter of Arianism, and it was this fellow who apparently actually baptized the emperor on his deathbed. In 326, Constantine decided to start work on making Nicomedia a world-class capital. But as legend has it, as his own town planners were going around with their measuring tapes, eagles suddenly swooped down, grabbed the measuring equipment from the surveyors, and carried the stuff over to Byzantium, where they dropped it. This was considered too obvious an omen to ignore, and Constantine decided to rebuild Byzantium instead, which was originally called New Rome, though it soon was better known as Constantinople, the city of Constantine. This is a view of Constantinople, now Istanbul as it looks today, from across the Golden Horn, the entrance to which is at the center. In the distance you can see Hagia Sophia, about where Constantine's palace was. In this picture, you're looking back from above the much later Blue Mosque in the foreground and Hagia Sophia, which we'll hear about next time, to the north of it, with the Bosporus on the right and the entrance to the Golden Horn at the upper left now. This would have been the heart of the city in Constantine's day, and he began the building of a palace complex that extended from about where Hagia Sophia and the Blue Mosque are to the right down to the Sea of Marmara, and for hundreds of years this was regarded as the most splendid such place in the world, but there's nothing left of it to give any hint of this. One of the few things Constantine might still recognize here is the so-called Column of Constantine, also called the Hooped Column, which stands to the west of this area in what was then the Forum. It was erected to mark the official founding of the city in 330 after the completion of the walls that ran from the Golden Horn across to the Sea of Marmara. Although there's no building in Constantinople that still stands from the age of Constantine, the tomb of his daughter Constantina in Rome, which became the Church of Santa Costanza, does still exist. Like the mausoleum of Diocletian we saw earlier in Split, it's annular, that is, round or centrally planned. In Western Europe, annular churches were always pretty much an exception to the favored basilica or rectangular plan, and many of the most famous exceptions, the Pantheons and other, were not built to serve as churches at all, but were taken over, like Santa Costanza here, for that purpose. The original mosaic decoration survives, depicting a grape harvest, which of course suggests the wine of the Eucharist, as well as the passage in the Gospel of John where Jesus compares himself to the stem of a grapevine with the apostles as the branches. Despite these Christian connections, however, there's still a sort of pagan Bacchic quality as well about decoration like this.
In the apse is a more obvious Christian subject, Jesus with Paul and Peter. This mosaic is thought to be from about 600, although the date is uncertain. In any case, it is probably at least a century later than the earlier, less obviously Christian subjects.
This is the Church of St. John Lateran as it looks today. In Rome, of course. Although nothing of the church itself survives from Constantine's day, St. John Lateran was built on the first property given by Constantine to the church in Rome. The property had actually been owned by his wife Fausta's family, the Laterani. This became then the Cathedral of Rome and preceded the building of the Church of St. Peter by 10 years or so. The popes also made the Lateran Palace their usual residence until after the Avignon captivity in the 14th century, when Gregory XI returned to find grass growing in the church and wolves in the piazza. The popes were still crowned here, though, until this ceremony was moved to St. Peter's after the unification of Italy in 1870. The church as it stands is essentially a product of the 17th century with an 18th century facade. The baptistry attached to the church, though, of St. John Lateran is much older than the church itself, however, and tradition says that in fact Constantine was baptized here, though there is no good evidence to support the claim. Nevertheless, it is a venerable building which was constructed at least not long after Constantine's day, and it may in fact be the oldest Christian building still performing its original function anywhere. Here's the interior, which has been altered a lot over the centuries. Like many baptistries, it's octagonal. The claim is often made that baptistries are octagonal because the octagon was midway between the four-sided square that represented earth and the perfect circle that represented heaven. Baptistries were originally separate from churches themselves, in part at least because it was thought improper to have scantily clad people flopping around in a tub in the church. Total immersion and therefore baptistries were never popular north of the Alps, where there was a risk of freezing the new converts. We'll get back to Constantine shortly, but first I want to talk just a bit here about the important editorial work that was done on the Bible later in the 4th century.
What you see here is one of the oldest surviving fragments of the New Testament.
a piece of the Gospel of Luke which was written down about 200 AD. By this time, a general consensus had been reached about what works should be included in the official Christian scripture. The so-called Muratorian canon of about the same date contains almost all of the books which were to make up the New Testament. And in the 4th century festal letter of St. Athanasius, this is the same fellow I mentioned in connection with the Council of Nicaea, there's drawn up a list of books identical to those in the modern New Testament. In 1844, Lobgott von Tischendorf, the great German biblical scholar who was still just 29 at the time, discovered the Codex Sinaiticus here in the monastery of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai. Most of this is now in the British Museum. It sort of stands to the New Testament the way the Dead Sea Scrolls stand to the Old. Codex Sinaiticus is, along with Codex Vaticanus, which is also a product of the 4th century, thought to contain the earliest surviving essentially complete copies of the New Testament books. This is Codex Sinaiticus now in the British Museum. It was written in Greek and originally contained the Septuagint in addition to the New Testament. The Septuagint, remember, is the Greek version of the Old Testament produced in the 3rd century BC. It is thought that most of the New Testament was originally written in Greek, although Jesus apparently spoke Aramaic, a Semitic language closely related to Hebrew. Once the lingua franca of much of the Near East, it's now essentially a dead language. At the Second Coming, I'm afraid Jesus is only going to be understood by a few university professors. It's likely that Codex Sinaiticus is one of the 50 Bibles Constantine himself requested Eusebius of Caesarea to have made for the churches in his diocese. Codex Alexandrinus in the British Museum here was made slightly later than Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, perhaps around 400 AD. All these early manuscripts are in Greek, but by the 4th century, Greek was becoming a language less and less understood in the West. And in 382, Pope St. Damasus assembled a synod in Rome, the result of which was to put the official imprimatur of the Pope on the Bible that, in the Latin translation of St. Jerome, would become the Vulgate, from the Latin word vulgus, meaning everybody or the common people, of the Middle Ages, used by virtually all in the West, calling themselves Christians until the Reformation, and by all Catholic churches essentially until Vatican II. St. Damasus also definitively claimed that he, as Bishop of Rome and successor to St. Peter, was the head of the whole Christian Church, and in conjunction with the project to translate the Bible into Latin, it was established that this was also to be the language of the Mass. None of these developments were, of course, greeted with much applause in Constantinople, where Greek was the language of the Church. Here we are back in the cloister of St. John Lateran. As I mentioned earlier, this is actually the Cathedral of Rome, and to be a cathedral is to have the seat or cathedra of a bishop. And the cathedra in the cloister here from the earlier church is popularly held to be the very one which belonged to St. Damasus. In reward for his effort in rendering the Bible into official Latin, and for his many other accomplishments as well, St. Jerome is recognized as one of the 4 great doctors of the Western Church.
With only minor qualifications, the oldest surviving copy of the Latin Vulgate Bible is Codex Amiatinus, now in the Laurentian Library in Florence. It was actually made at the double monastery of Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow in northern England about 700 AD, around when the Venerable Bede, about whom more later, was in residence and who was very likely involved in the making of it. It was intended as a gift for Pope Gregory II, but Abbot Chelfred, who was taking it, died en route, and it wound up at the monastery on Mount Amiata in Italy, which is the source of its name. It contains what is probably a picture of Cassiodorus, again more about him later, who is given credit for the earlier so-called Codex Grandior version of the Vulgate, which had been brought from Italy to England by Chelfrid and which is thought to have been essentially reproduced in Codex Amiatinus. Codex Grandior no longer exists.
St. Jerome became very popular in the Renaissance for the way he combined the virtues of both Christian and classicist. In fact, he's said to have had a vision in which the Lord berated him, saying, "Thou art not a Christian, thou art a Ciceronian," which led him to beat himself on the chest with a rock to the consternation of his pet lion, which was his companion and which is often his attribute or symbol in works of art. In this context, before we return to Constantine's day, I want to mention quickly his nephew Julian, who was the last emperor to attempt to suppress the Christians, though he was not a great persecutor of them. It wasn't so much that he hated the Christians as that he was reluctant to give up the classical traditions which he felt were threatened by them. In fact, many Christians themselves were to feel this same reluctance, and it can be argued that one of the most important projects of the Christian church in the Middle Ages was trying to figure out a way to include the best of pagan classicism, in some way at least, in Christianity. Julian would probably be pleased to know that Dante asks for the help of Apollo at the outset of the Paradiso, that Milton invokes the Muses, and that St. Thomas Aquinas quotes Aristotle more than he quotes the Bible. Julian might have done considerable damage to Christianity had he been granted a long reign, but he died in 363 after only 2 years as emperor. The Church of St. John and St. Paul in Rome honors not the famous apostles, but rather 2 Christians said to have been martyred in Julian's day. A fellow Christian named Pamachius, who was also a friend of St. Jerome, founded this church in their honor, and it may well have been built originally during the reign of St. Damasus. There's a footnote to the story of the martyrdom of John and Paul that's of special interest to the English also. Crispus and Crispinian are said to have also been martyred shortly thereafter when they were caught praying here at the site where John and Paul were buried, and their bodies were then also buried under what became this church. If you've forgotten, the Battle of Agincourt took place on their feast day, October 25th. Most of this church, including the interior, is not early medieval, but as a work of architecture, the front of this church is very interesting. The portico in front, though it is a later addition, replaces an earlier such portico, and the facade behind this, with its 5 arched openings, is part of the original 4th century building. This arrangement of a colonnaded portico in front of a basilica was to be very popular with Italian architects for centuries, and we'll see it repeated again and again. The little street to the left is, incidentally, the Cliva Scari, which has been known by that name for 2,000 years.
From the Cliva Scari, one can enter the Roman house which has been excavated beneath the church and which is decorated with well-preserved frescoes. This one is said to represent Proserpina, the Latin equivalent to Persephone, but I'm not sure why.
In 324, Constantine, at the request of Pope Sylvester, began the building of the Basilica of St. Peter, on the site where St. Peter is thought to have been buried. Within 20 years of the traditional date for the death of Peter, there was apparently a shrine on this spot, but until the legalization of the faith, no large church honoring him could be built. No evidence that would convince an inveterate skeptic has been found that he was buried here, but there certainly is much circumstantial evidence that he was, and even most non-Catholic scholars are willing to give the church the benefit of any doubt about the matter. The original church of Constantine's day, as you can see in this drawing, bore a strong resemblance to St. John and Paul. It was a basilica with a colonnaded portico in front and also an enclosed courtyard or atrium, which was also once part of the complex of St. John and Paul. It also had a transept, and it may in fact have been the first church to have one and thus achieved the most popular ground plan churches would use until the present day. This feature not only made the church bigger, in fact the Constantinian St. Peter's was the biggest church in the world in the 4th century, it also gave it the shape of the cross, which was thought a nice idea. This church survived essentially until the 16th century, when it was rebuilt, as we'll see next quarter, by Bramante, Michelangelo, and others.
Santa Pudenziana here is at least one of the oldest places of Christian worship in Rome, and it is one of those places which has been left well below street level by the rise of the city, essentially created by rebuilding on top of the rubble of previous building without hauling it away. As with most such places, the archaeological history is complex, but there are remains of a 2nd century house surviving here, and the church was apparently built into part of a set of pre-existing baths, possibly from Hadrian's day. The apse mosaic is 4th century and depicts Santa Pudenziana at right, offering a crown to St. Peter, and her sister, St. Praxedes, offers one to St. Paul, as Christ sits enthroned in the center.
Another building in Rome which is very important in the context of the early history of the church is San Clemente. What you see here is the wall that encloses its courtyard or atrium. Not many churches in downtown Rome still have their atriums, because the demands of urban civilization have required the large open spaces they once occupied. Here you are inside the atrium now, and although the facade is 18th century, it does retain the ancient look of the transverse portico in front of the basilica. This facade also faces east, as is the case with, typically, only the very earliest churches like St. Peter's and St. John Lateran. By the 12th century, the original church here was virtually underground,
as is the case, as we just saw, with Santa Pudenziana.
Here you see the interior of that 12th century church now, which itself contains some things like the balustrade around the choir that once decorated the earlier church. The mosaic in the apse may also contain some of the tesserae of the original, of which this is possibly at least a copy. But while this 12th century building is itself an ancient church, what is especially interesting here is what was discovered in the 19th century beneath the floor. When it was decided to rebuild the church, the existing 4th century building was just filled in with rubble to raise the floor level to that of the street in the 12th century. In the 19th century, the 12th century church was propped up to allow the excavation of this rubble, so that one can now descend, if not exactly into a 4th century church, at least into a 4th century space, which amazingly still has much of the early medieval fresco decoration surviving on its walls. Not only that, a 1st century AD house survives, which had itself been filled in with rubble to make a foundation on which to build the original church. A Mithraeum was also discovered among the very complex and extensive underground archaeological remains here. We're going to go down there now, and while we do so, we'll hear what is often called the earliest surviving piece of Christian music, the Hymn to the Trinity, written about 300 AD and discovered at Oxyrhynchus in Egypt in 1918. The text is Greek, and the music is written in what is called Greek alphabetic notation. Here you see what this 4th century space looks like, although only the walls go back that far. The pillars were erected in the 19th century to support the church we were just in. On this wall you can see some surviving scraps of what are probably 9th century frescoes. And on this wall at the far left, you can see a portrait of Leo IV with a square halo indicating that he was alive at the time the picture was painted. The square halo usually indicates that the wearer is expected to become a saint but isn't one yet. And here you can see the house below that church. This was possibly the residence of Titus Flavius Clemens, a cousin of the Emperor Domitian, in whose house the future Pope and Saint Clement once may have served as a slave. Okay, that's the end of Part A.